Well, hello, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Dr. Louise Bertini, the Executive Director of the American Research Center in Egypt, and I want to welcome you to our April public lecture with Dr. Janice Yellen, titled The Arts of Ancient Meroe, Reassessing an Ancient African Visual Culture. Before I introduce Dr. Yellen, for those of you who are new to RC, we are a private, nonprofit organization whose mission is to support research on all aspects of Egyptian history and culture, foster a broader knowledge about Egypt among the general public, and support American-Egyptian cultural ties. As a nonprofit, we rely on RC members to support our work, so I want to first give a very special welcome to any RC members who are joining us today. If you are not already a member and are interested in joining, I invite you to visit our website, rc.org, to join online and learn more. We provide a suite of benefits to our members, including our private member-only lecture series, and also includes a reduced rate to our annual meeting as part of your member benefits, which this year will again be virtual. And it will take place this month from April 22nd to 25th, and registration is now open. We hope to see you all there for a great couple of days of papers on all aspects and time period of Egypt's cultural heritage. And you can again register on our website, rc.org, and find more information there. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Yellen. Dr. Janice Yellen is a professor of art history at Babson College. Her research centers on the ancient African kingdoms of Kush, particularly the kingdom of Meroe. She has published numerous articles on Meroitic religion and its elite funerary culture, particularly as documented in the royal pyramid chapels of Meroe and Jebel Barkal, as well as Meroic visual arts. Her research on the royal pyramids of Meroe with the late Frederick Hinkle and their conservator was funded by National Endowment of the Humanities and the Getty Senior Research Grants. A member of the recently completed Qatari mission for the Pyramids of Sudan project, she now continues this work in tandem with the German Archaeological Institute, home of the Hinkle Research Archives. She is particularly interested in exploring the dynamics of Kushite and Egyptian interactions and in identifying the Egyptocentric bias that has distorted our understanding of the Kushite culture as it plays out in these areas of cultural expression. So welcome, Dr. Yellen. Take it over.
Thanks and welcome, especially in light of the Great Egypt Parade. I am sincerely hoping it's recorded on YouTube. But today we'll jump into the arts of Meroe, and it's a challenging and interesting window into the Meroitic mind and sensibility. Their arts encompass a rich body of sculptures, as well as decorated pyramid chapels, temples, ritual objects, jewelry, ceramics, and faience, and golden plaques. One of the things that's always been challenging is that there's a strong presence of Egyptian features, and that's allowed an outdated and actually unsupported Egyptocentric, and I'll be defining that, Egyptocentric viewpoint, to shape our perceptions of Meroitic culture and its art. It constructs, this Egyptocentric viewpoint constructs the Meroitic and its preceding Napatan period as imitative or derivative of Egypt and its arts. And this really obscures the vibrant Kushite nature, and it misses the independent manner in which Kushite artists use and understand foreign features, particularly those from Egypt. So today what I'm going to do to address this and try to get us closer to an understanding of the Meroites through their arts is I'm going to present a kind of overview of Meroitic art rather than an in-depth examination of individual examples in order to explore the essential Kushite nature while demonstrating how an Egyptocentric approach has, and this is used in other areas of Kushite culture as well, how this has distorted our understanding of Meroitic art in ancient Meroe. And at the same time, toward the end, I will also introduce you to the basic eclectic nature of Meroitic art and its uses of not only Egyptian features, but features from the Mediterranean world. So with that, Meroe is the last of the three great kingdoms of Kush, the successor state of ancient Napata, which also includes the 25th dynasty that ruled Egypt for nearly 100 years. And it's the furthest south in terms of the epicenter of these three great Kushite kingdoms. A Meroitic plaque of Prince Ari Khan Horror. And what I'd like to ask you to do is, what do you think about when you first see this? Did you find, or do you find yourself thinking in terms of Egyptian art? And then measuring how Egyptian this looks, the imagery, the appearance of the figure, the execution of the carving? If you find yourself doing that, well, welcome to an Egyptocentric viewpoint. Using that viewpoint has led to the labeling of Meroitic art as, I'm not kidding, I've seen these terms, degenerate, poorly understood copies or bad imitations of Egyptian art. So this kind of metric has led to this kind of judgment. Now, measuring this art against familiar Egyptian imagery, especially for Egyptologists and people familiar with it, is kind of a natural reaction. So what I'd like to do today is reframe that reaction. Hopefully, even in the initial reaction, you were kinder in your judgment than some of these. But it's important to understand how it's developed and what it means. This Egyptocentric viewpoint, that is measuring Kushite culture, not just Meroitic art, but Kushite culture against ancient Egypt and what we know about ancient Egypt, has its birth at the beginning of Nubian studies, because the first people to explore and write about ancient Nubia were Egyptologists, such as George Reisner and John Harstang. And they were people of an unfortunate time and place when racial prejudice was endemic and very pernicious. The quote from Reisner you see above, and I want to read it because it really shows not only an Egyptocentric viewpoint, but an Egyptocentric viewpoint when it's wedded with racism. And this has really been something that has clung and burrowed its way into Nubian studies and needs to be addressed. The tradition of Egypt became the Ethiopian tradition. And all of Ethiopian culture, and here I should say that when we use the term Ethiopian, it's an old word, and they're talking about Nubia, not the modern country. And all of Ethiopian culture rests on Egyptian, since this is not an indigenous tradition. So Ethiopians have no culture. It was all Egyptian. Ethiopian culture diminishes as the historic memory fades and the Egyptian, i.e. the good culture, fades away. So Nubian is only as good as its Egyptian. And as one seems to see a weakening of Egyptian, or what would be considered a misunderstanding of Egyptian, it loses its quality and its respect. It's a pretty astounding statement. But nonetheless, there were still vestiges one finds throughout reading, especially older authors, but unfortunately even fairly contemporary ones. Now, there's a basis for this Egyptocentric viewpoint, obviously. You saw those Egyptian features in the little stele that I started with when I asked you to think about it. And there's a long history of Egyptian-Nubian contact and interaction. The major period is during Egypt's New Kingdom, when the Egyptians really colonialized a large portion of Nubia, as you see in that encircled area. And Egyptologists take their thinking to some extent, or I should say they don't take it. They didn't need help, unfortunately. They justify their thinking about the inferior Nubians conquered by the superior Egyptians, that narrative, because the Egyptians themselves talk about the Cushites sort of in that way. They call it wretched Cush. The Egyptians seem to have a disdain for their Cushite subjugated people, if we want to call them that. And of course, the modern scholars who saw these texts were only too happy to accept what was really political rhetoric. The Egyptians said it about everybody who was an Egyptian, especially if they wanted to dominate them. And Egyptologists readily took that as justification for, unfortunately, the racial prejudices abroad in Western culture. The reality is much more nuanced than that. And Stuart Tyson Smith, Michelle Bouzon, and others who deal in more contemporary Nubian archaeology have demonstrated that the Egyptian presence in Nubia was far more entangled and far more complex than this narrative that Egyptologists adopted from the Egyptian official records. And indeed, you have thousands over centuries, thousands of Egyptians coming to live and work: priests, soldiers, craftsmen, merchants, scribes, bureaucrats. And they're there, and they live and die there, and they marry there. So you get an entanglement, an interaction between the Egyptians and the Nubians that's far more nuanced than stamping on their heads as wretched Cushites. And indeed, at the end of the New Kingdom, when Egyptians stopped dominating Nubia, in fact, they were having trouble dominating their own country, the Egyptians who lived in Nubia didn't just pack up and go home. This is where they were born, many of them. This is where they had married, where they lived. So what we find is an ongoing tradition of entanglement, of Egyptian and Nubians marrying, living side by side, in some ways blending their cultures. These tumuli burials after the collapse of the New Kingdom show Nubian women buried with Egyptian husbands. We know this by the kinds of burial customs used to prepare their bodies for the graves. So it's very clear that the Egyptian presence in Nubia created a dynamic community of sharing of ideas and culture and religion, and not the narrative of superiors dominating inferiors without any kind of cultural interaction. There's a long history of these entanglements. Probably the epicenter for this Nubian Cushite entanglement would be Jebel Barkal, the holy mountain, which was the capital of Egyptian focus during the New Kingdom, at the great temple to Amun there. It was the center of the second Cushite kingdom of Napata, as many of you know. And it is Napata, whose capital was at Jebel Barkal at Napata, is the successor state for Meroe, where we'll be focusing our attention today. But there are millennia of entanglements by the time we get to the Meroitic period. And indeed, after the Egyptians leave with the rise of the Napatan dynasty, we begin a history where the Southern Nile Valley is ruled by these two kingdoms for nearly a millennium. It's quite a track record. So when we think about Meroe, as well as Napata, but particularly for us today, Meroe, we need to think about this Egyptian presence and the culture and ideas they brought with them from a Nubian viewpoint. They've known it forever. There was Uncle Ramose. They went to Egyptian temples that certainly just shut down and go out of business at the end of the New Kingdom. People didn't pack up and come home in the thousands. So we really need to think that for the Nubians, this was a living, embedded presence that was familiar and that they shared in. Now, the third kingdom of Kush, Meroe, dates typically from 300 to 350 CE of our era, and its opening is marked by a change in capitals from Napata south to Meroe between the fifth and sixth cataracts. This transition was dramatic. What marks it is the royal burials of the Napatan kings moved from Jebel Barkal south to Meroe. And at first it was posited that this was due to some kind of great political rupture or break and a dramatic change in cultures represented by this move south. We now know that although the royal burials do move to a family cemetery, the Southern Royal Cemetery, in about 270 BCE, there's no major disruption in the Napatan polity, or as far as we can tell, in Napatan traditions. And this really isn't surprising because we find Napatan presence at Meroe starting in about the 800s BC, and in the 9th century BCE, that is. Their cemeteries, family burial grounds, the Napatan rulers themselves spend more and more time at Meroe in the royal palace and enclosure and great temple to Amun they built there. Family members are buried in two major burial grounds in the west and south cemeteries. So the move to Napata that typically marks the Meroitic period, the move from Napata, that typically marks the Meroitic period is actually not a cultural disruption. The Meroitic period really doesn't begin for probably several generations later when we begin to see cultural features that are distinctly not Napatan, possibly because a different local family gained the throne and they brought with them substantially different cultural traditions. How do we mark this change to the Meroitic period? Well, a dramatic one is the emergence of a written language. Although Meroitic might have been spoken as early as the Kerma period, there seem to be Meroitic names in Egyptian texts. As a written language, it doesn't really appear until the late 2nd century BCE. I'm sorry, mid-3rd century BCE. It's a distinctive language. It uses Egyptian hieroglyphs as a basis so we can phoneticize it, but it's not completely translated, although Claude Rilly has been making serious headway, having identified its good neighbor language as its language family. In addition to the written language, elements of religion change. The Meroites have long worshipped, as did the Napatan, Egyptian gods such as Amun, Mut, Isis, Osiris. And again, I would say, consider if people have been worshiping a god in your country and family members for 1,000 years, why is it still a foreign god? Nonetheless, we do see for the first time the Ptolemaic and his consort Amisemi appear in at least tangible, recognizable visual form. And you can see that the Meroites are so comfortable with Egyptian imagery that when they physically manifest this god, at least for us, he's shown in typical Egyptian fashion, human body, animal head, or in fully lion form. And that's something Egyptians did too. His consort Amisemi looks distinctly more Cushite. And we'll talk more about Cushite characteristics of representation, but you can see her depicted on that wall from the Lion Temple and from a stele where she gives life to Queen Amani Sheheto. And ta-da, we see the emergence of Meroitic art. It is distinctly different than Napatan, as you can see in the comparison between these two Meroitic stele on our right and Napatan Dynasty 25 figure from Taharka Shrine at Kawa. We'll talk more about what's distinctive about these differences, but I don't think it takes a great PhD knowledge to see how dramatically different Meroites conceptualize their self-representations. Now, before we can really begin to identify what is Cushite in Cushite art, it's good to get rid of this Egyptocentric way of looking at things. And to do that, it helps to know what your assumptions are when you look at it. It processes so quickly we can often label things and box them without even realizing it. So I've come up with a very short list of what I think are Egyptocentric viewpoints for looking at art. And I base this on my own experience because I've been horrifically guilty of doing this for my first years in the field since I come from Egyptology. And for me, it looked really good if it looked Egyptian. Luckily, I think I'm recovering from that. But I just basically thought about what I've brought to the table in my checkered past. So I don't pretend this is a scientific or exhaustive look, but I think it's close enough to what most people and what most Egyptologists do. The assumption that, like Egypt, these official things are large scale and there's lots of resources, and that the art is created by workshops manned by trained artisans under the support of official state structures like temples. And the results of this kind of workshop system, if you will, is you do get a consistency of style, of features, of handed down tradition that can extend over long periods of time, as well as continuity in the way something looks and the quality with which it's made. And I think, again, very broad generalizations here will be used, so forgive me in advance. I think in general, that's true of Egyptian pharaonic art. I'm talking the pharaonic period. Instead, what you have at Meroe is a much smaller state economy and a much more limited scope of activity, which means that you don't really support a large community of artists the way the Egyptians did. So you don't have that infrastructure workforce. I could find no evidence, physical or otherwise, for a workshop system. And that has lots of implications in terms of that consistency of style and quality and of rules, so to speak. As a result, Meroitic art is much more varied. The quality is much more varied, but artists have a lot more freedom and a lot more ability to innovate, and we will see that happen. So it's a mixed blessing when you don't have a workshop system. And one of the things to keep in mind is that it's a much smaller workforce and that there's not a state institutionalized art style, so to speak. And so foreign influences, a foreign visitor, you could have a much stronger impact on what's being made against a more monolithic system. So without this workshop system and this ongoing continuity of style, you don't really have developed canons, rules for the production of visual imagery. There are no canons for the proportions of the human figure. I spent one summer measuring Meroitic sculptures all over Europe, and they just didn't have ratio proportions. You can find a tendency, but there's not a great deal of consistency. Egyptians do that combination of views, which I'll show you in a minute, which is how you can represent something solid and three-dimensional on a flat surface with the most characteristic viewpoints. Meroites will do that more often than not. In some ways, it's easier than doing a foreshortened viewpoint of something three-dimensional as it turns in space, but not always. And in terms of telling a story over time, they're like the Egyptians, and indeed like our comic books and cartoons, they put the narrative along the ground line in sequential episodes. So that's very typical all over the world. But just one example of what I mean. So here's the typical Egyptian canon of proportions with a grid superimposed that will also establish those proportions. And of course, the combination of viewpoints that we're so used to: profile head, frontal shoulders, profile lower body. So at least two different viewpoints combined into one, because those are the most characteristic ways those shapes will look. And in the Meroitic door jam next to it, you can see that they've happily followed that combined viewpoint. But not always. Sometimes we get full profiles, beautifully rendered and foreshortened. Sometimes we get their own combination of viewpoints, which is a fully frontal upper torso superimposed with a fully profile lower torso. This kind of variety drives Egyptologists crazy, or at least some of them. And that's where the Egyptocentric viewpoint begins to get judgmental. The fact that they are not following the rules. Don't they know what they are? Instead of looking at the artist's ability to execute with some originality. Now, I know I said we didn't find the same kind of consistency in canonic order that you see in the workshop systems of Egypt, but we do find tendencies in certain periods when there's enough art being made to actually support ongoing community of artists and train them well, such as in the middle of the first century CE, right around the end of the first century BCE to the mid first century CE. And in these spaces, you can see that there's a certain consistency of style in the eyes and that nice little full cheek and chin underneath the cheek, the elongated eyelids. Will suggest that when there's enough work going, you do get groups of artisans moving from job to job and possibly training their successors. But without more evidence for this, it would seem that this is not typical and that there aren't these huge, relatively huge periods of building activity. But again, so little is known that I live in hope that I'm wrong. It gives you a chance to see the variety possible even within the period. All right, we're back to our friend Arifan Horror. And let's try this again now that maybe you become a little bit aware of how judgmental you might have been in terms of looking at this in Egyptian terms. And frankly, when I look at it, I still see the Egyptian elements first, the combination of viewpoints. Of course, that pose of smiting or killing the enemies, which goes back to the Palette of Narmer, is an iconic one. So how do we understand Meroitic art and separate it from these things that seem so compellingly Egyptian or Egyptocentric? Well, first of all, start looking at what is Meroitic underneath that layer. And one of the things to know about Meroitic art that's very different than Egyptian is that it's eclectic. It will draw in one image or one time period from many sources without any great consistency, and they're comfortable with that. They happily appropriate or adapt or absorb other kinds of art forms and use it and mix it in ways that may or may not be consistent with the next time they're used. And this little breakdown of Arifan Horror's Steely gives you some sense of just how eclectic they can be. That's Cushite. That openness, that innovativeness is indeed Cushite. So knowing about this eclecticness, what is Meroitic and Meroitic art? If they take this, they take that, and they seem to stew them a little bit together. Oh, there's a lot. You just have to start looking for it. They, even when they reuse Egyptian things or things that seem Egyptian, they totally readapt it. The typical Egyptian offering table is a fundamental piece of funerary equipment. You can see it there on your upper left. And beside it in the center and to the right are two Meroitic offering tables. And at first glance, the shape is right. And they even use it in the same context for funerary offerings. But the decoration and the text, these are actual funerary rituals being shown. Those are gods impersonating Anubis and a companion goddess, often the goddess Nephthys, actually making the offerings at the tomb. That's why there are double figures in the central one, and you'll notice that the women have their hands raised to their forehead in a gesture of mourning. There is a funerary text carved on it, but unlike the Egyptian text, the Hotep di Nesu, an offering which the king gives, this one has a different content. It does start with a request for food, as the Egyptian does, But then many of them go into an extended genealogy of the offering table owner. Because in Meroitic society, as indeed in much of Africa, even today, ancestor veneration is important. And this is probably a clan-based society. So your place inside the clan is very important to establish, which you do with this genealogy. So the offering table is rethought to suit Meroitic funerary beliefs and indeed even Meroitic social structures. A second example is the Babur. Egyptians conceptualize an empowered aspect of the dead, the Ba, as a bird who can fly back and forth from the tomb to receive offerings and actually make use of offerings being made for the deceased. But if you look at the Meroitic version, the human head is still there, the wings are still there, but the body is human. It is not typically the body of a bird. These bobirds are now avatars for the deceased, showing their social role, not necessarily a portrait of their physicality, but of their social status, establishing, much like the offering table inscriptions, the deceased place in society. So they reuse and rethink and reinvent what on the surface looks very Egyptian, but below the surface is entirely Cushite in the way that they use it. They do the same things with stylistic and iconographical features that may look Egyptian or in some places even classical to us. But before we can tease that out, just want to clarify a point that makes me a little bit crazy, so bear with me. And that's the difference between iconography and style. People will sometimes conflate them, and it really muddies the water. I feel like such a school teacher now, but it's true. So bear with me. This is iconography, and that are meaningful symbols that you know in a cultural context. The staff, a particular crown, Cinderella's glass slipper. You see a glass slipper somewhere, you know it's about Cinderella. That's iconography. It's a meaningful symbol in a cultural context. Some of the icons they use are Egyptian. Some of the icons they develop are Meroitic Cushite. So we'll find in their iconography an interesting combination of Egyptian icons used in Meroitic ways and their own inventions. That's different than style. Style is how something looks. The way that the face is depicted. So you can see the difference in the style of the faces between the Napatan and the Cushite faces I'm showing you. Style can speak to the proportion of the bodies. You can see the much more slender, elongated proportions of the Napatan goddess on the left and those wonderful, abundant Meroitic bodies of Amanishakhetu and the goddess with her. So that's where we look at when we look at style. And often what gets lost is that even when something looks Egyptian, the style is Cushite. The language they're speaking, the rhythms they're using are Cushite ones. So one of the Meroitic features, let's see if you jump a little bit there with me. So when we're looking at style, let me show you some other elements of Cushite style. Surface ornamentation, they adore it. They take natural textures, natural materials, and they turn them into very elaborate surface patterning, like the scales of the snake of the god Apetamak here growing out of a kind of snake body. I'll be returning to that image and the unusual iconography very shortly. They abstract natural forms. Over time, the abstraction gets greater and greater as just a general tendency, but they can do very natural looking modeling, but what they seem to like to do is take a form and emphasize the underlying geometry, simplifying it to its basic geometric shape. And here you can see that there are degrees of abstraction in these guardian lions from different palaces in Meroe. The bobbards we just talked about are a symphony of different approaches. They can go from very natural. I sort of started on our left and got more and more abstract as your eyes move right. But you can see that while some artists are very capable, I suspect they all were, except maybe the guy on the far right, of doing very natural forms. You can see that there's a taste for abstraction, especially in that female barbird second from the right. And so what you have within Meroe, and these are all roughly from the same area, and even, again, there's a big span here, I admit, but they know one another's works, and there are a lot of these, I cherry pick them. So this eclecticism that I talked about, that's part of Cushite sensibility, even in the treatment of the barbirds. They seem perfectly happy to make one more abstract, one more natural. It just depended perhaps on the artisan or the client. But there's a kind of acceptance of this variation that's distinctively Cushite, as is this taste for abstraction. And this taste for abstraction is not unique to just the Meroitic period. This little amulet of a winged falcon from Napatan shows these same kind of tendencies. And indeed, when one looks at Napatan art, although it seems closer to Egyptian because of their chronological closeness and the Dynasty 25 rule of Egypt, still underneath, and I'll show you another example, there are these Cushite tastes for this geometric abstraction and simplification. They're perfectly comfortable acknowledging their own Egyptocentric viewpoint, shall we say, when they do Egyptian goddesses, like the figure of Isis on the right, on this bark stand, four-sided bark stand, one of the four sides, compared to the queen, Natakamani, for whom the bar stand is made along with her, well, actually probably her son, Natakamani, this is Queen Amonitore, sorry. And on the other side is her son, Natakamani. But look at the difference both in the proportions, but also notice this is a good Egyptian combination of view. Egyptian goddess, Egyptian proportions, Egyptian rendering, Meroitic queen, their preferred proportions. And notice that it's a totally different combination of view. It's that fully frontal upper torso, upper chest, then put onto a profile view of the lower torso. So again, this willingness to experiment with forms or to do forms as the artist sees fit for either expressive or taste purposes makes Egyptologists crazy. Again, broad brushes are Egyptologists, but when you have this expectation of regularity in canonic treatment, it becomes baffling, especially at less sophisticated times. Now, I talked about the fact that these Meroitic preferences or tendencies were not unique to the Meroitic period. Notice in the stele of Queen Amani Shafeta with the goddess Ameseti, again, those wonderful full proportions and a celebration of abundance through these very carefully expressed roles of body. Sorry, no other way to describe it, body fat. Skin is only good if you have a lot of food. And when you're in a climate or a culture where food might be at scarcity, this looks a lot better. That's just one of my theories, don't shoot me. But what you have here in the body type, you can see in this little amulet from the Napatan period, this love of the fullness and kind of female voluptuousness of the body. So there's the underpinning where this has always been there. And when you strip away some of the Egyptocentric preferences of even the Napatans, it percolates up to the surface. And again, showing a Napatan connection to the Meroitic period and thus to more fundamental Cushite aesthetics. Taharqa, 25th dynasty, Napatan king Atlamirsa, and then two Meroitic figures, the king and his son, Prince Arqa. You can see a very kind of interesting simplification of the head as a kind of more flat, topped, flat back of the head, the way it will be somewhat flatter. This is a little fuller, but it's still not exactly brachycephalic. And then a very cylindrical neck going into very broad and often very flat shoulders. This is actually the viewpoint that the king was shown on the bark stand. I flipped these two in order to have them facing the same way so it would be easier to make the comparison. But you can see that same kind of similar treatment of the head and kind of, again, the underlying geometry and simplification of the geometric forms going right back into the Napatan period. And finally, in terms of Cushite representation, just unmediated imagery of Cushite features. These royal heads have a variety of techniques. She's not royal, she's elite, but nonetheless nicely Cushite face. Variety of techniques, but they all share a very distinctive and non-Egyptian representation of their physiognomy. So alongside these Egyptianized features is always this very Cushite sensibility that merges with the Egyptian style, that finds a kind of meeting place that's comfortable for the Cushites. Another element of Cushite art, really vivid actual scenes, often in formal contexts, like this dancing and drumming scene. The one on the top right is from a pyramid chapel, so this probably went with the funerary procession or maybe entertainment at the funerary meal after the burial. But you can see the neck dancing, the drumming. I love the stubble. Just the sense that you're seeing a very real and vivacious scene playing out for you in both these contexts. So something that really clearly happened during certain kinds of ritual contexts, whether a Dionysiac ritual that may be on the cup and a burial that may be from the chapel. This was the way that people gathered to celebrate. And you even sometimes get a little sense of the actuality of people. This little snippet is from a pyramid chapel wall where you have rows and rows of family members carved on this pyramid chapel, coming to worship the funerary rites and the burial of the rulers to whom the chapel belonged. And at first they seem almost numbingly the same, you know, figure, 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 male, 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 female, female, female. And I was photographing, because I do this, one of the walls, the detail of one of the walls, and I'm walking along and they're slightly differently posed and they're holding somewhat different kinds of grains. Some of them have swords, some of them have other kinds like emmer. And I'm going along and so I hit this little guy and there's this small old man, kind of hunchback, round shouldered, moving along with the funeral procession. It's kind of like it's Uncle George who came to show up. So there's a sense of something that the artist actually saw here, struck him and recorded. And this also runs through Meroitic art. You get these glimpses of artists' remembrance of what they've seen, as opposed to a kind of stereotypical execution. And there's a great deal of originality in the use of visual imagery. Just two of them from Naga, the Lion Temple at Naga, the three-headed Epidemic, which has launched 1,000 academic articles about Indian Meroitic contact, multi-headed gods, which may simply come down to a creative way to show the god equally responding to Narakamani and Amanituri, the king and queen. And this image of the lion-headed god coming out of a snake also sent people looking far and wide through Asia, through the Middle East for parallels, when actually it's probably a much more formal version of the Epidemic in a more local kind of imagination. And this is from a Meroitic cemetery north of Meroe, Semna South. But what we find here is taking maybe a piece of folk art and formalizing it on a temple. So the artist just knew this image, probably, this is not unique, this little example from Semna, and just used it to decorate and honor the god whose temple this is dedicated to. So that gives you some sense of what's lurking underneath this Egyptian surface and how to look beyond that Egyptian surface. But you can't run away from the fact that the imagery clearly has Egyptian connections, like the smiting of the enemy scene we see above from the pylon of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, and the pylon at the Lion Temple of Naka showing Nadak Amani and Amonitory smiting enemies in an extraordinarily similar pose. So what do we see here? What's really going on? The iconography and the subject matter is Egyptian, but the execution is again really Meroitic. There's the proportions we talked about, there's the abstraction, there's the patterning of the surface, there's iconography like the lion god of Ptolemies being added here, the winged vultures and falcon for the king and the queen. These images have no precedent in Egypt, and they take the Egyptian narrative and tell a different story with it. And as I've been talking, I hope you've had a chance to also look at what I wrote. And although I hate people who read PowerPoints, you can read for yourself. I'm about to do it because I think it's a really important point in terms of thinking about these Egyptian things in a different way. The Egyptian and Nubian culture have been entangled for millennia, as I briefly discussed. And so what I'd like everyone to consider when they see something that looks this Egyptian is how Egyptian is it really? To us it is, but to them, we're talking about the Nubian viewpoint. They're assimilated features. They've been living with them for a thousand years, maybe even more, going back to Middle and Old Kingdom in Egypt. So the question then is, at what point does a visual feature like this, or the worship of a goddess like Isis or Amun, when do they stop being foreign? When are they no longer Egyptian, but something you may share with the Egyptians that might be similar, that might be related, but they're no longer Egyptian, and we have to allow the Cushites to own them at some point. And I'll give you just another quick example. Here on a pyramid chapel wall, because I must do at least one pyramid chapel, you have this section which you have in close-up, and what you have is an Egyptian judgment after death, good Book of the Dead scene, Osiris on the throne, the green arrows, Osiris and the demon who will devour you if you're not true of voice, and the scales of justice. And the red arrow points you in both things. Maybe you recognize it, a figure leading 4 calves to a threshing floor, the hut behesu, the driving of the calves. Pure Egyptian imagery. The hut behesu is from temples. There's a few peripheral examples of it in tombs, but not in really the heartland of Egypt. It's a temple scene. The judgment after death, of course, is an archetypal mortuary scene. What are they doing there? If we're being Egyptocentric, boy, they really didn't understand it, because what does one thing have to do with the other? Well, actually they did, because the hut behesu also has a funerary meaning that after the deceased is buried, the dead Osiris is buried, his son Horus tramples the tomb with the calves to hide it from Osiris's enemy, Set, and others. So the hut behesu does have a funerary meaning, and it's one that ensures a good Osirian burial. And by doing it, the son of Osiris, Horus, also helps legitimate himself. He has performed the proper burial for his father. So there's elements of transition and legitimation in this that put it rightly so into a tomb context. And of course, once properly buried, the deceased goes to the judgment hall to be judged to a voice and justified. The scene of the pyramid chapel on our right from Beguine North 51, which is several centuries later, looks looks sort of Egyptian again, enthroned ruler clearly Isis, but you notice all these Egyptian vignettes have faded away. We have Anubis and the goddess pouring a libation in the fragment of the center. So over time, the scene gets distilled. The Egyptian elements do fall away. We get closer to the Meroitic understanding of the most core thing about a burial, the afterlife. And because ancestor veneration and your place in that society is so important, you still have your family members. They move off the bottom and into the center. But in all these cases, even with this Egyptian seeming feature, the Meroites are using those elements in ways that speak directly to their own belief system and their own desires. There's no misunderstanding here. So that, in a nutshell, is how to think about, or how I hope you'll think about, the Egyptian features in Meroitic art. What's Cushite about how they're used, what's Cushite in the way they think about them, and how Cushite aesthetics marries with them. Having said that, the Cushites are like any other people. They're still open to foreign influences or foreign ideas, especially filtered through their northern neighbor, the Ptolemies of Egypt. But again, even there, when they take something not Egyptian, they do it with Meroitic style and proportions. This, I thank Robert Bianchi for sending me this parallel, a nice Ptolemaic queen, where you can see the similarity of robe and even the corkscrew curls, but a much heavier proportion. So again, style, not iconography. The proportions of the style are clearly Meroitic. So even when they take them, there's an aesthetic at play here that we recognize as theirs. And this is just used here as a counterpoint from roughly the same period where you can see when it's an unmoderated kind of sculpture, what remains Cushite as compared to this little faience statuette. And again, Hellenistic influences do come in, but through Ptolemaic Egypt, perhaps. It's hard to know if there's any direct influence from the Mediterranean world, or whether it's all moderated and filtered through contact with Ptolemaic versions of it, and how the Ptolemaics might respond to it. But there were prestige gifts and there were trade items like this little terracotta oil lamp from Wad Ben Naga. And I'm not suggesting the Hellenistic influences that you could see in this unrolled, thanks to the modern wonders of computer images. It was a rounded cylinder object similar in shape to this one. This kind of Hellenistic Dionysiac scene is seen by a Meroitic artist. It's fascinating to try to think about what a Meroitic artist would have thought seeing this oil lamp and the way we have this frontal, nicely foreshortened view of the knees and legs. And again, not saying this is one-to-one, but you could see that maybe you see something like this and you begin to think of a different way to represent the figure. Free and more independent than most Egyptian artists, Meroitic artists could very well attempt to use it, think about it, transmute it into a work of art that they're making. And I think the most amazing example of this possible kind of scenario are what are called the royal baths. Excavated in the early 20th century by John Garstang, this was some kind of royal water feature. And it was filled with Hellenistically influenced sculptures. I don't know what to say about them in the sense that you can find clear Hellenistic models, but what that feature represented, how the Meroitic artists saw them, because there's a clearly local manufacturer. It's very clear that the artist was struggling with new kinds of body forms and anatomy than they would have typically ever tried to attempt. And yet they bravely forged on and created these life-size, which is also unusual in Meroitic sculptures, usually over large or small, these life-size sculptures wrestling with some pretty complicated and new poses. A copybook, small terracotta figurines. But the concept of the water feature itself is really interesting to think that hundreds of miles down the Nile, there was a kind of Alexandrian or Roman water feature attached to the royal palace at Meroe. But just as an example of what happens when you try Contrapposto, that is the kind of weight shift that's so traditional in Western art. When you try it, body turning in space and Contrapposto, sort of what can go wrong. But the artist is willing to jump in and try it. The reception of it in Meroe, again, when you don't have this kind of Roman model to look at, you might have been perfectly happy with it. And a later nudes are not typical in Meroe. So again, this suspicion of classical influence deposed aside. This nude, which seems to be a little bit later and somewhat different facial features and seems to be from a different group or different artist. Very open, not close to the body, the extended arms, the negative space around everything. Again, speaks to this kind of eclecticism and openness to variety and experimentation that marks Cushite art. I'm not saying these are one-to-one, but they give you an idea of the kind of figure the Meroitic artist might have had access to in some way, shape, or form and attempted to duplicate it. So within the realm of Meroitic art, there's this tremendous variety, sense of innovativeness, exploration, a taste for the underlying geometry of forms, a taste for these very solid, heavy proportions, a love of surface ornamentation, and just a real willingness to go for it and an openness to new influences and new styles that's really, subjectively speaking, rather admirable. So back to more typical Meroitic art that's not mediated or influenced by mind-boggling encounters with Hellenistic art, mind-boggling perhaps to the Meroitic artist. And you can see again in these over-large statues that Meroitic preference for very heavy volumes, for kind of compressed solid proportions. And it seems to be something that, again, going back to where we started, the underlying Meroiticness of Meroitic art, that seems to run through the sculpture. And I've returned to it because I think it's time to turn the table and suggest perhaps a Nubiocentric viewpoint in this New Kingdom sculpture of a temple at Girth Hussein. And now I'm not suggesting a direct link. Obviously, this is centuries earlier than these Meroitic figures, but you see these kind of same proportions. And when these Nubian rock-cut temples were being built by the Egyptians, the workforce was probably Nubian. So what I'd like to suggest is when we're looking at these rock-cut temples of Nubia, the New Kingdom, that perhaps there was a Nubiocentric viewpoint or style that shaped the work of these faience or rock-cut tombs. And that long before the Meroitic kingdom, long before the Napatan kingdom, you have a local aesthetic that shows itself again and again over time, as can certainly happen, these underlying tastes through visual quality. So we can start with Egyptocentric, but I think if nothing else, do consider what the Nubians were thinking when they encountered this other culture and chose, and the operative word really is chose to use Egyptian or foreign features in the creation of art that was very much an expression of their own sensibilities and culture. Thank you. So I think we have time for a few questions. And so I'll hand the floor over for taking them. There we are. Hi.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Yellen, for such an incredible lecture. I am so grateful for you and everybody else who was able to join us to take some time out today, especially with the parade. I want to thank you all for joining us. And if you're interested in RC's efforts to support research on Egypt's cultural heritage, I urge you to visit rc.org and make a contribution today. We rely on your support to make our work possible. And thank you again, and I look forward to having you all join us for the virtual annual meeting from April 22nd to the 25th. To respect everybody's time, we will be taking a few questions for Dr. Yellen here. I'll do my best to address all of them as quickly as possible. But yeah, we will start with Evan Baxter. Dr. Yellen asked, how do we know, I'm not an Egyptologist, so please excuse my lack of pronunciation. How do we know Nike or Nike isn't a Cushite god?
Oh, so then who is the Cushite? Apedima?
I'm sorry?
Which god is the Cushite god?
Nike or Nike, however you would like to say it.
Oh, Nike.
Nike, okay.
Well, you can't be 100% sure because she is not a traditional Nike, Hellenistic Nike form. It's a winged female showing up in a scene of triumph and victory, which is the context that you'd expect a Hellenistic Nike, the goddess of victory, to be depicted. But in her iconography, the crown she's wearing, you see sometimes on earlier Meroitic creams. There's some debate about what that kind of plume or horsetail crown is. So I won't go to the mat on that one. The context seems right for a Nike, but beyond that, the actual iconography and style is unique. Unfortunately, there may be some on jewelry and little insignias that I'm not recalling, but in more formal context like this one, I can't think of any analogies. So the Nike is with a question mark.
Thank you. And I believe afterwards, Jane Hathaway asked if there's any Persian influence here for her. And parts of it looks almost like Sansayan. I'm sorry for butchering that, but I believe we have that answer that we don't know yet. Moving forward, Amr, or is it Amir? I apologize for the name. Some of the imagery is mildly reminiscent of the Amarna period, the hips, for example. I know that this is an Egyptocentric viewpoint, but I'm curious if you have any comments.
I'm not sure, Amir, and I hope I'm saying that right too, which particular thing looked Amarna style for you, but I can't say I personally have ever noticed that, but that doesn't mean I haven't missed it. It's certainly the 18th dynasty under Akhenaten had a presence in Nubia. Again, Pa'aten was one of the names they had. And I think it was Jebel Barkel. Forgive me, it's been a long time if I've got that wrong. But I think when they take Egyptian art by the Meroitic period in particular, you'll notice they do the iconography much more than the style. And it's sometimes the subject matter, like the smiting the enemies. But that was one of the distinctions. So thank you for helping me surface that. They'll use the iconography, which is almost like the text of an image. But the style, as I hoped I pointed out, is really very much a Cushite one. So I'd be curious to know what looked Amarna to you, but I can't say it struck me quite the same way.
Thank you. Mara asked that, I missed what you said about meaning of women touching their foreheads, and what was the meaning behind it?
Oh, that's an Egyptian imagery, but I suspect we find it. It's the sign of mourning. People often throw dirt on their head when they're mourning. And that's like a shorthand for mourning woman. I believe even one of the hieroglyphic determinatives has that. So it's a mourning pose. It's a shorthand for being in mourning, at wailing or ululating, or accompanied it sometimes.
Mr. Stephen asked, do you think the small amount of known text in Meroitic script is a function of what has been found or of a cultural favoring of oral tradition over written text?
Who knows? But no, I'm being, we're still excavating a lot, and a lot has been lost, and it's kind of, you can see I'm kind of temporizing here. We know that they also wrote on leather. Papyrus is not common there, but because they didn't have the papyrus plants, but we know they wrote on leather, and that's an organic material that of course is vulnerable to decay. And a lot of the Meroitic tombs, especially in the northern half of the country, are now at least above groundwater. But I'd have to say, with accidents of archaeology aside, I think it's fairly an oral culture. And however the official government kept its records, we haven't come up with any archives of like papyri or written text or cuneiform clay tablets like we found in other parts of the world. So it's kind of interesting that we have such a scarcity of text in Meroe. Does it indicate a culture with strong oral tradition? Probably, but it always makes me wonder how they conducted the administration of the country and what kind of record keeping forms they've used that we've lost track of.
Thank you. Well, Marilyn has a really quick question. Where and what is the background of your photo?
Oh, this, which the one of the pyramids?
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful? Oh, the one behind me now.
Yes.
That's by Chester Higgins, who is an amazing photographer who worked for many years on the staff of the New York Times. And trust me, you know Chester's photographs. He's done some of the iconic ones. He's spent many, many years photographing in Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia along the Nile. In fact, he's preparing a book of his photographs that should be stunning. So I've met him in the course of my work, and he was kind enough to share this with me so I could have a really nice background. But wait, let me get out of the picture. Now you can really see it. It's just wonderful. It deserves to not have me blocking it. But a few of those were by Chester Higgins, in fact. So it's just a real gift to have them in there. But yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? I wish I could say I took it.
Thank you. To respect everybody's time and then so that everybody can go and enjoy the parade, I'll answer one more question. And if you guys have any other questions, you can always email us and we will pass them along to Dr. Yellen. So we can do that. I'll take one more and then we will let you guys enjoy this wonderful parade. What is the reason behind massiveness in the Cushite statuary?
The massiveness of what, of the Cushite statues?
Mm-hmm.
Taste. It's could kind of, I mean, we could all speculate about why they like these very substantial proportions, but they're powerful. There could be a little bit of pragmatism to it in that they, stand stress and force when you're carving them. But I don't think you need to make them that massive to make them sturdy or less vulnerable to breakage. They can just be closed, hands at sides. It seems to be an underlying taste for those kind of proportions. Even those bauberts I showed you, the ones that were more abstract, although they physically weren't massive. If you can go back and just Google Meroitic bauberts on your own, you'll see that they have that same sense of massiveness, whether they're, a meter or half a meter. There's a sense of heft and weight that seems to be innate in the Cushite taste. And if you know to look for it, you start really seeing it. And it's who they are. It's what they like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yellen. I am so grateful. Thank you, all members, all supporters who joined us today. I would let you all go to enjoy this wonderful parade that we are having in Cairo right now. Seems pretty exciting. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I am excited to hop off this call and jump on that one. If you guys have any questions about RC, please visit rc.org. And thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon, evening, wherever you are from, log in from, and bye-bye.
Thank you for coming. Bye.
Of course. Dr. Yellen, that was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't talk from notes, so I just hope what I said is okay.
It was wonderful. Thank you. And yep, enjoy your day. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome. Go enjoy your parade. I
Yeah.
was proceeding out of
All right.
courtesy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.